There are official legal documents from the 13th century that say King Arthur led an expedition to the North Pole. Not a poem, not a fairy tale, legal documents. And in 1577, one of the most respected cartographers in history wrote a letter confirming it, based on sources he had personally read. Those sources are gone now, hunted down and destroyed. And the version of Arthur we were left with is the one someone decided we were allowed to have. Most of us grew up with the same King Arthur, the Round Table, Excalibur, Merlin, a very English legend set somewhere in the misty British countryside. But Arthur shows up in Japanese tradition as a hero called Yamato Takeru. The Ossetians of the Caucasus have their own version called Batras. He appears in French, Danish, Norwegian, Spanish, and Italian sources too. That kind of reach doesn't come from one small island. It points to something much older, a common source that got scattered and retold in pieces around the world. The two books that would explain all of this are gone. One was called the Inventio Fortunata, the Blessed Discovery. The other was the Gestis Arturi, the Deeds of Arthur. We don't have them. What we have are references to them from people who read them before they disappeared. And what those people describe changes everything about who Arthur was and where he actually went. Quick pause. If you're new to this channel, we cover forgotten and alternative history here, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks. If this is your kind of thing, hitting subscribe and leaving a like would mean a lot. Alright, back to Arthur. For over 150 years, from roughly the late 1400s through the 1600s, maps produced across Europe, China, and Japan all showed the same thing at the top of the world. Not a frozen ocean, not an empty ice cap. 4 large islands arranged in a ring around the North Pole, with a massive mountain at the very center and a powerful whirlpool at its base. The waters between the islands were described as indrawing seas, currents so strong that no ship could push against them. Martin Beheim's globe from 1492 shows it. Johannes Ruysch's world map from 1508 shows it and actually names the Inventio Fortunata as his source. Mercator's famous 1569 world map shows it in a polar insert that cartographers have studied for decades because it contains geographic details about Hudson Bay and its river systems that weren't discovered by anyone else until the 19th century, 300 years later. There are Chinese maps showing it, Japanese maps showing it, scores of independent maps from completely different cartographic traditions, all drawing the same configuration at the North Pole. And then at some point, it was simply removed. The islands vanished from the maps, the mountain disappeared, the whirlpool was gone, and the new maps showed what we see today, just ice and open water, as if those 150 years of consistent mapping had never happened. Nobody announced the change, nobody published a correction. It was just quietly erased. Now here's where the legend and the maps start to connect. In 1577, the cartographer Gerardus Mercator wrote a detailed letter to the scholar John Dee. Dee had asked him directly, where did the information in that polar map come from? Mercator explained that he had borrowed a travel book called the Itinerarium, written by a man named Jacobus Knoyen, and had taken detailed notes from it. Knoyen's book drew heavily from the Gestis Arthuri and the Inventio Fortunata. Mercator's letter survived. Knoyen's book did not. It vanished like the others. But what the letter describes is remarkable. It says that Arthur, around 530 AD, led a campaign northward, past Scotland, past Iceland, through the islands of the North Atlantic, with the specific intention of reaching and controlling the polar islands described on those maps. Islands where, according to the ancient sources, there were cities in the mountains surrounding the pole. This wasn't just Mercator speculating. John Dee, one of the most learned men in 16th century England, compiled a formal document called Britannici Imperii Limitis, the limits of the British Empire, and presented it to Queen Elizabeth I. In it, he argued that because Arthur had once extended his kingdom to include Greenland, Iceland, and the islands of the North Pole, England had a legitimate territorial claim to those regions and to the New World. This was a legal argument presented to a reigning monarch, based on documented sources that Dee had personally examined. And the sources themselves were not new. The legal text, Leges Anglorum, written around 1210, already described Arthur's northern empire in detail. A fragment from 1199 called Insulae Britanniae lists the same northern islands as British possessions, using nearly identical place names. The tradition of Arthur as an Arctic ruler goes back at least 800 years in written records, and the written records themselves were drawing from something older that is now lost. Dee himself noted that a historian named Polydore Virgil had burned the evidence. His words, willfully and wickedly, a whole cartload almost. What the surviving sources describe of Arthur's polar expedition reads like nothing in the romanticized versions of the legend. In the spring of 530 AD, Arthur's army had spent the winter in the northern islands of Scotland. On May 3rd, part of the force crossed to Iceland. 4 ships came down from the north to warn Arthur about the indrawing seas, the powerful currents pulling toward the pole. Arthur stopped there. He colonized the islands between Scotland and Iceland and pushed into Greenland, where the sources say he encountered people of extraordinary stature. Then, the following year, he sent 12 ships with 1,800 men and 400 women northward into the polar islands. 5 of those ships were wrecked in a storm. 7 made it through. 4,000 men who entered the indrawing seas in an earlier part of the campaign never returned. Those aren't the numbers of a fairy tale. Those are the numbers of a military expedition. 5 generations after Arthur's men settled in the polar islands, 8 of their descendants reportedly returned to Norway. 2 of them were priests. 1 carried an astrolabe. They described the geography of the northern islands in detail, the mountains, the cities, the extreme conditions. One of them reported that 4 years earlier, an English monk from Oxford had visited the northern colony, documented everything he saw, called it the Inventio Fortunata, and eventually gave the book to the King of England. At some point, the Inventio Fortunata ended up in circulation among a very small group of powerful people, and the trail leads somewhere unexpected. The biography of Christopher Columbus, written by his own son Fernando, contains references to a book that Columbus carried on his voyages, a book that described islands far to the west, floating masses of vegetation and stone, lands beyond the Atlantic. Fernando's biography was first published in 1537. By the time later editions came out, those references had been quietly removed by translators. Researchers who went back to the 1537 original found what had been taken out. The Spanish historian Bartolomé de las Casas also referenced the same book in his own historical writings from 1570, connecting it directly to Columbus's knowledge of what lay to the west. Then there's the Ottoman admiral Bedi Reis, whose famous 1513 world map is already a mystery in its own right. Bedi Reis wrote on the map itself that a Spanish sailor, captured by his uncle, had sailed with Columbus on 3 voyages, and described how Columbus had found a book that told him exactly where to go and what to expect when he got there, including the detail that the indigenous people there valued glass beads, which Columbus then used in his early exchanges. The only book in existence at that time that described America was the Inventio Fortunata. Columbus knew where he was going, and the book that told him was the same one that described Arthur's polar islands, the 4 northern islands on Mercator's map, and the cities and the mountains at the top of the world. In 1497, a Bristol merchant named John Day, who also went by the name Hugh Say, wrote a letter to someone he called the most magnificent and most worthy lord, the Lord Grand Admiral. In the letter, he says he cannot find his copy of the Inventio Fortunata, apologizes for it, and sends a copy of Marco Polo and the latest maps from John Cabot's voyages instead. That letter was sitting in a Spanish archive untouched until 1956. John Day was connected to virtually every major player in the so-called Age of Discovery. He knew the families who employed Columbus in the 1470s. He did business with the royal treasurer of the Indies enterprise. He was related by marriage to Henry VIII's Master of the Mint and to the Bristol merchants who financed John Cabot. He had connections to Icelandic traders and to the most powerful merchant organization in England, the same organization that later sponsored the Mayflower. One man, at the center of everything, in possession of the book, and nobody seems to know who he really was. The Invencio Fortunata made it into Columbus's hands. It made it into Mercator's hands. It was cited by historians, admirals, and monarchs. And then, at a certain point, it simply ceased to exist. Every copy gone. Every book that referenced it either burned, suppressed, or lost. The maps showing the polar islands were quietly updated. The Gestis Arthuri vanished, Kinoyan's Itinerarium vanished, and Arthur was reduced to a romantic myth about a sword and a stone. So here is what we actually have. Legal documents from 1210, a letter from Mercator in 1577, a formal territorial argument presented to Queen Elizabeth I, scores of maps from independent cartographic traditions across multiple continents, all showing the same geography at the North Pole. References from Columbus's own family and from Ottoman admirals pointing to the same lost book. And a merchant nobody can fully identify sitting at the center of all of it. None of this is fringe material. These are documents in national archives, letters in the British Library, maps in major collections around the world. They're just not connected. And when you connect them, the picture that forms is not the one we were taught. Was Arthur real? Was the polar geography on those maps accurate? Was the Inventio Fortunata the most suppressed book in history? Those aren't questions I can answer, but I'd rather ask them honestly than pretend the evidence doesn't exist. Leave what you think in the comments, and in episode 2, we go to what the ground itself is telling us, because something is buried under the Arctic that has no business being there. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who loves history, and don't mess episode 2 on this channel. It picks up exactly where this one ends.